Erev Tov, everyone. Erev Tov. It is Monday night. It is 8 p.m. here on the east side of the United States, here in the diaspora. This is the Maimon Beit Knesset. Therefore, it must be Zeyde Story Corner. That's right, Zeyde Story Corner once again. Okay, so we are going to continue our stories from the book by Isaac Bashevis Singer. Wonderful stories. Yes, actually, very wonderful stories, especially tonight's story. Let's see who we have in the chat room, shall we? We have Yair, we have Shoshi, we have Marilyn, Veronica, and Richard and Marshall. And so anything going on? Not really. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, not really. Not a whole lot going on out there this week, since the secular world will be between their holiday and their New Year's, and we had that months ago. Yeah, we did. We did have our Hanukkah or our New Year's. Our Rosh Hashanah was months ago, so we're ahead of everybody on that. So we should probably get on with the story. So it's a great story. Yes, it is. It is a really nice story. So let us get you onto your camera. And here I am, magically transported to Eretz Israel and standing at the hotel. But not really. It's a wonderful picture. Okay. It makes me feel almost like I was there. Okay, so we are going to continue our stories from the Stories for Children by Isaac Bashevis Singer. And this story, where we left off last week, is called Naphtali, the Storyteller, and his horse Sus. Okay, so we begin. The father, Zelig, and the mother, Brina, both complained that their son, Naphtali, loved stories too much. He could never go to sleep unless his mother first told him a story. At times, she had to tell him 2 or 3 stories before he would close his eyes. He always demanded, "Mama, more." Fortunately, Brina had heard many stories from her mother and grandmother. Zelig himself, a coachman, had many things to tell about spirits who posed as passengers, and imps who stole into stables at night and wove braids into the horses' tails, and elf locks into their manes. The nicest story was about when Zelig had still been a young coachman. One summer night, Zelig was coming home from Lublin with an empty wagon. It just so happened that he hadn't picked up any passengers from Lublin to his hometown of Yano. He drove along the road that ran to the forest. There was a full moon. It cast silvery nets over the pine trees and the strings of pearls over the bark of the tree trunks. Night birds cried. From time to time, a wolf's howl was heard. In those days, the Polish woods still swarmed with bears, wolves, foxes, martens, and many other wild beasts. That night, Zelig was despondent. When his wagon was empty of passengers, his wallet was empty of money. and there wouldn't be enough for Brina to prepare for Shabbat. Suddenly, Zelig saw lying in the road a sack that appeared to be full of flour or maybe ground sugar. Zelig stopped his horse and got down to take a look. A sack of flour or sugar would come in handy in a household. Zelig untied the sack, opened it, took a lick, and decided that it was ground sugar. He lifted the sack that was unusually heavy. Zelig was accustomed to carrying his passengers' baggage, and he wondered why a sack of sugar should feel so heavy. It seemed I didn't have enough to eat at the inn, Zelig thought. And when you don't eat enough, you lose strength. Well, he loaded the sack into the wagon. It was so heavy that he nearly strained himself. Kind of like you shoveling snow this morning. All right, let's not get into that. Well, I was just saying. Okay. So anyway, he sat down on the driver's box and pulled on the reins, but the horse didn't move. Zelig tugged harder and cried, "Letra," which is Polish for giddy up. But even though the horse pulled with all his might, the wagon still wouldn't move forward. What's going on here? Zelig wondered. Can the sack be so heavy that the horse can't pull it? This made no sense, for the horse had often drawn a wagon full of passengers along with their baggage. There's something here that's not as it should be, Zelig said to himself. He got down again, untied the sack, and took another lick. What in heaven? This sack is full of salt, not sugar. Zelig stood there dumbfounded. How could he have made such a mistake? He licked again, and again, and it was salt. Well, it's one of those nights, Zelig mumbled to himself. He decided to heave this sack off the wagon, since it was clear that evil spirits were toying with him. But by now the sack had become as heavy as if it were filled with lead. The horse turned his head backwards and stared as if curious as to what was going on. Suddenly Zelig heard laughter coming from inside the sack. Soon afterwards the sack crumbled, and out popped a creature with the eyes of a calf, the horns of a goat, and the wings of a bat. The creature said in a human voice, "You didn't lick sugar or salt, but an imp's tail." And with these words, the imp burst into wild laughter and flew away. Dozens of times Zelig the coachman told this same story to Naphtali, but Naphtali never grew tired of hearing it. He could picture it all. The forest, the night, the silver moon, the curious eyes of the horse and the imp. Naphtali asked all kinds of questions. Did the imp have a beard? Did it have feet? How did its tail look? Where did it fly off to? Zeyde couldn't answer all the questions. He had been too frightened at the time to notice the details. But to the last question, Zeyde replied, he probably flew to beyond the dark regions, where people don't go and cattle don't stray, where the sky is copper and the earth iron, and where the evil forces live under roofs of petrified toadstools and in tunnels abandoned by moles. Like all children in town, Naphtali rose early to go to Cheder. He studied more diligently than the other children. Why? Because Naphtali was eager to learn to read. He had seen other boys reading storybooks, and he had been envious of them. How happy was one who could read a story from a book? At 6, Naphtali was already able to read books in Yiddish. And from then on, he read every storybook he could get his hands on. Twice a year, a bookseller named Reb Zevulon visited Yano, and among the other books in the sack he carried over his shoulder were some storybooks. They cost 2 groschen a copy, and although Naphtali got only 2 groschen a week allowance from his father, he saved up enough to buy a number of storybooks each season. He also read the stories in his mother's Yiddish Pentateuch and in her books of morals. When Naphtali grew older, his father began to teach him how to handle horses. It was the custom in those days for a son to take over his father's livelihood. Naphtali loved horses very much, but he wasn't anxious to become a coachman, driving passengers from Yanal to Lublin and from Lublin to Yanal. He wanted to become a bookseller with a sack full of storybooks. His mother said to him, "What's so good about being a bookseller? From toting the sack day in and day out, your back becomes bent, and from all the walking, your legs swell." Naphtali knew his mother was right, and he thought a lot about what he would do when he grew up. Suddenly he came up with a plan that seemed to him both wise and simple. He would get himself a horse and wagon, and instead of carrying the books on his back, he would carry them in the wagon. His father, Zelig, said, "A bookseller doesn't make enough to support himself, his family, and a horse besides. For me, it will be enough." One time when Reb Zevulon, the bookseller, came to town, Naphtali had a talk with him. He asked him where he got the storybooks and who wrote them. The bookseller told him that in Lublin there was a printer who printed these books, and in Warsaw, in Vilna, there were writers who wrote them. Reb Zevulon said that he could sell many more storybooks, but He lacked the strength to walk to all the towns and the villages, and it didn't pay him to do so. Rabbi Zebulun said, I'm liable to come to a town where there are only 2 or 3 children who want to read storybooks. It doesn't pay me to walk there for a full groschen. I might earn, nor does it pay for me to keep a horse or hire a wagon. What do these children do without storybooks? Naphtali asked. And Reb Zebulun replied, they have to make do. Storybooks aren't bread. You can live without them. I couldn't live without them, Naphtali said. During this conversation, Naphtali also asked where the writers got all these stories, and Reb Zebulun said, first of all, many unusual things happen in the world. A day doesn't go by without some rare event happening. Besides, there are writers who make up stories. They make them up? Naphtali asked in amazement. If that is so, then aren't they liars? They're not liars, Reb Zebulun replied. The human brain really can't make up a thing. At times, I read a story that seems to me completely unbelievable. But I come to some place and I hear that such a thing actually happened. The brain is created by God, and human thoughts and fantasies are also God's work. Even dreams come from God. If a thing doesn't happen today, it might easily happen tomorrow. If not in one country, then in another. There are endless worlds, and what doesn't happen on Earth can happen in another world. Whoever has eyes that see and ears that hear absorbs enough stories to last a lifetime and to tell his children and grandchildren. That's what old Reb Zebulun said, and Naphtali listened to his words agape. Finally, Naphtali said, when I grow up, I'll travel to all the cities, towns, and villages, and I'll sell storybooks everywhere, whether it pays me or not. Naphtali had decided on something else too, to become a writer of storybooks. He knew full well that for this you had to study. And with all his heart, he was determined to learn. He also began to listen more closely to what people said, to what stories they told, and to how they told them. Each person had his own manner of speaking. Reb Zebulun told Naphtali, when a day passes, it is no longer there. What remains of it? Nothing more than a story. If stories weren't told or books weren't written, man would live like the beast, only for the day. Reb Zebulun said, today we live, but by tomorrow, today will be a story. The whole world, all human life, is one long story. 10 years went by. Naphtali was now a young man. He grew up tall, slim, fair-skinned, with black hair and blue eyes. He had learned a lot at study house and in the yeshiva, and he also was an expert horseman. Zelig's mare had bore a colt, and Naphtali pastured and raised it. He called him Sus. Sus was a playful colt. In the summer, he liked to roll in the grass. He whinnied like the tinkling sound of a bell. Sometimes, when Naphtali washed and curried him and tickled his neck, Sus burst out in a sound that resembled laughter. Naphtali rode him bareback like a Cossack. Pui, Cossacks. When Naphtali passed the marketplace astride Sus, and the town girls ran to the windows to look out. After a while, Naphtali built a wagon. He ordered the wheels from Leib the blacksmith. Naphtali loaded the wagon with all the storybooks he had collected during the years, and he rode with his horse and his goods to the nearby towns. Naphtali bought a whip, but he swore solemnly to himself that he would never use it. Sus didn't need a whip, or even to have the whip waved at him. He pulled the light wagon load of books eagerly and easily. Naphtali seldom sat on the box, but walked alongside his horse and told him stories. Sus cocked his ears when Naphtali spoke to him, and Naphtali was sure that Sus understood him. All times when Naphtali asked Sus whether he liked the story, Sus whinnied, stamped his foot on the ground, and lifted Naphtali's ear with his tongue as if to say, "Yes, I understand." Reb Zebulun had told him that animals live only for the day. But Naphtali was convinced that animals have a memory too. Sus often remembered the road better than Naphtali, did. Naphtali had heard the story of a dog whose master had lost him on a distant journey, and months after they had come home without their beloved pet, he showed up. The dog crossed half of Poland to come back to his owners. Naphtali had heard a similar story about a cat. The fact that pigeons fly back to their coop from very far away was known throughout the world. In those days, they were often used to deliver letters. Some people said this was memory, others called it instinct. But what did it matter what it was called? Animals didn't live only for the day. Naphtali rode from town to town. He often stopped in villages and sold his storybooks. The children everywhere loved Naphtali and his horse Sus. They brought all kinds of good things from home for Sus: potato peels, turnips, and pieces of sugar. And each time Sus got something to eat, he waved his tail and shook his head, which meant, "Thank you." Now, not all children were able to study and learn to read, and Naphtali would gather a number of young children, seat them in the wagon, and tell them a story, sometimes a real one, and sometimes a made up one. Wherever he went, Naphtali heard all kinds of tales of demons, hobgoblins, windmills, giants, dwarfs, kings, princes, and princesses. He would tell a story nicely with all the details, and the children never grew tired of listening to him. Even grown-ups came to listen. Often, I just realized, yeah, I know, I did too, yeah. Who comes to the story time? Yeah. Okay, so we get back to the story. Okay, we get back to the story now, okay. Whenever he went, the Naphtali heard all kinds of stories of demons, hobgoblins, windmill giants, dwarfs, kings, princes, and princesses. He would tell a story nicely with all the details, and the children never grew tired of listening to him. Even the grown-ups came to listen. Often the grown-ups invited Naphtali home for a meal or a place to sleep. They also like to feed Sus. When a person does his work not only for money but out of love, he brings out the love in others. When children couldn't afford a book, Naphtali gave it to him for free. Soon, Naphtali became known throughout the region. Eventually, he came to Lublin. And right there is where we are going to pause, and we are going to take our 6-minute break. And when we return, we shall find out what happened to Naphtali, the storyteller, and his horse, Sus. So, everyone, stay tuned. We be back in 6.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can't be beat. The sparkling drinks are just dandy. The chocolate bars and the candy. So let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
It's intermission time, folks, so hurry, hurry, hurry. Step right over to our refreshment center for the most extravagant array of refreshment goodies ever assembled under one roof. Enjoy breathtaking, mouth-watering goodies, everything from a snack to a delicious full meal. At our refreshment center, you'll find a large variety of goodies to satisfy your hunger, your thirst, or your sweet tooth. So hurry, hurry, hurry. Visit our refreshment center now. The show starts in 5 minutes. show starts in 4 minutes. The show starts in 3 minutes. The show starts in 2 minutes. The show starts in 1 minute. And now, on with the show.
And we are back, just as promised. Okay, let's find out what happens to Naphtali, the storyteller, and his horse, Sus. Okay, so he goes to Lublin. In Lublin, Naphtali heard many astonishing stories. He met a giant 7 feet tall. Wait a minute, 7 feet tall. Who do I know that is 7 feet tall? Oh, your father-in-law. Yes, my father-in-law was 7 foot tall. Yeah, he's a big guy. Yes, we used to call him sir. Yeah, very good. Ha, 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 ha. Anyway, He met a giant 7 feet tall who traveled with a circus and a troupe of midgets. At the circus, Naphtali saw horses who danced to music as well as dancing bears. One trickster swallowed a knife and spat it out again. Another did somersault on a high wire. A third flew in the air from one trapeze to another. A girl stood on a horse's back while it raced around and around the circus ring. Naphtali struck up an easy friendship with the circus people, and he listened to their many interesting stories. They told of fakirs in India who could walk barefoot over burning coals. Others let themselves be buried alive, and after they were dug out several days later, they were healthy and well. Naphtali heard astounding stories about sorcerers and miracle workers who could read minds and predict the future. He met an old man who had walked from Lublin to the land of Israel, then back again. The old man told Naphtali about Kabbalists who lived in caves behind Jerusalem, fasted from one Shabbat to the next, and learned the secrets of God, the angels, the seraphim, the cherubim, and the holy beasts, the holy hayot. The world was full of wonders, and Naphtali had the urge to write them down and spread them far and wide over the cities, towns, and villages. In Lublin, Naphtali went to the bookstore and bought storybooks. But he soon saw that there weren't enough storybooks to be had. The storekeeper said that it didn't pay to the printers to print them since they brought so little money. But could everything be measured by money? There were children and even grown-ups everywhere who yearned to hear stories. I'm sorry. Yearn to hear stories, and Naphtali decided to tell all he had heard. He himself hungered for stories that could never get enough of them. So, more years passed. Naphtali's parents were no longer living. Many girls had fallen in love with Naphtali and wanted to marry him, but he knew that from telling stories and selling storybooks, he could not support a family. He had become used to wandering. How many stories could he hear or tell living in one town? He therefore decided to stay on the road. Now, horses normally live some 20-odd years, but Sus was one of those rare horses who live a long time. However, no one lives forever. At 40, Sus began to show signs of old age. He seldom galloped now, nor were his eyes as good as they once were. Naphtali was already gray himself, and the children called him Grandpa, or Zeyde. One time, Naphtali was told that on the road between Lublin and Warsaw lay an estate where all booksellers came, since the owner was very fond of reading and hearing stories. Naphtali asked the way, and he was given directions to there. One spring day, he came to the estate. Everything that had been said turned out to be true. The owner of the estate, Reb Falik, gave him a warm welcome and bought many books from him. The children in the nearby town had already heard about Naphtali, the storyteller, and they snatched up all the storybooks he had brought with him. Reb Falik had many horses grazing, and when they saw Sus, they accepted him as one of their own. Sus promptly began to chew the grass where many yellow flowers grew, and Naphtali told Reb Falik one story after another. The weather was warm. Birds sang, twittered, and thrilled, each in its own voice. The estate contained a tract of forest where old oaks grew. Some of the oaks were so thick they had to be 100 years old. Naphtali was particularly taken by one oak standing in the center of a meadow. It was the thickest oak Naphtali had ever seen in his life. Its roots were spread over a wide area, and you could tell that they ran deep. The crown of the oak spread far and wide, and it cast a huge shadow. When Naphtali saw this giant oak, which had to be older than all the oaks in the region, it occurred to him, what a shame an oak hasn't a mouth to tell stories with. The oak had lived through many generations. It may have gone back to the times when idol worshippers still lived in Poland. It surely knew the time when the Jews had come to Poland from Germany, the German states where they had been persecuted, and the Polish king Kazimierz the first had opened the gates of the land to them. Naphtali suddenly realized that he was tired of wandering. He now envied the oak for standing so long in one place, deeply rooted in God's earth. For the first time in his life, Naphtali got the urge to settle down in one place. He also thought of his horse. Sus was undoubtedly tired of trekking over the roads. It would do him good to get some rest in the few years left him. Just as Naphtali stood there thinking these thoughts, the owner of the estate, Reb Falik, came along in a buggy. He stopped the buggy near Naphtali and said, "I see you're completely lost in thought. Tell me, what are you thinking?" At first, Naphtali wanted to tell Reb Valik that many kinds of foolish notions ran through the human mind and that not all of them could be described. But after a while he thought, why not tell him the truth? Reb Valik seemed a kind-hearted man. He had a silver-white beard, the eyes that expressed the wisdom and goodness that sometimes comes with age. Naphtali said, if you have the patience, I'll tell you. Yes, I have the patience. Take a seat in the buggy. I'm going for a drive, and I want to hear what a man who is famous for his storytelling thinks about. Naphtali sat down in the buggy. The horses hitched to the buggy, walked slowly, and Naphtali told Reb Valik the story of his life, as well as what his thoughts were when he saw the giant oak. He told him everything, keeping nothing back. When Naphtali finished, Reb Valik said, my dear Naphtali, I can easily fulfill your wishes and fantasies. I am, as you know, an old man. My wife died some time ago. My children live in the big cities. I love to hear stories, and I also have lots of stories to tell. If you like, I'll let you build a house in the shade of the oak, and you can stay there as long as I live and as long as you live. I'll have a stable built for your horse near the house, and you'll both live out your years in peace. Yes, you are right. You cannot wander forever. There comes a time when every person wants to settle in one place and drink in all the charms that the place has to offer. When Naphtali heard these words, a great joy came over him. He thanked Reb Valik again and again, but the Reb Valik said, you need not thank me so much. I have many peasants and servants here, but I don't have a single person I can talk to. We'll be friends, and we'll tell each other lots of stories. What's life, after all? The future isn't here yet, and you cannot foresee what it will bring. The present is only a moment, and the past is one long story. Those who don't tell stories and don't hear stories live only for that moment, and that isn't enough. Reb Valik's promise wasn't merely words. The very next day, he ordered his people to build a house for Naphtali, the storyteller. There was no shortage of lumber or of craftsmen on the estate. When Naphtali saw the plans for the house, he grew disturbed. He needed only a small house for himself and a stable for Sus. But the plans called for a big house with many rooms. Naphtali asked Reb Valik why such a big house was being built for him, and Reb Valik replied, you will need it. For what? Naphtali asked. Gradually, the secret came out. During his lifetime, Reb Falik had accumulated many books, so many that he couldn't find room for them in his own big house, and many books had to be stored in the cellar and in the attic. Besides, in his talks with Reb Falik, Naphtali had said he had many of his own stories and stories told him by other writers down on paper, and that he had collected a chest full of manuscripts, but he hadn't been able to have the stories printed, for the printers in Lublin and in other big cities demanded a lot of money to print them, and the number of buyers of storybooks in Poland wasn't large enough to cover such expenses. Along Naphtali's house, Reb Falik had a print shop built. He ordered crates of type from Lublin. In those days, there was no such thing as a typesetting machine, as well as a hand press. From now on, Naphtali would have an opportunity to set and print his own storybooks. When he learned what the Reb Falik was doing for him, Naphtali couldn't believe his ears. He said, "Of all the stories I have ever heard or told, for me this will be by far the nicest." That very summer, everything was ready. The house, the library, the print shop. Winter came early. Right after Sukkot, the rains began, followed by snow. In winter, there was little to do on the estate. The peasants sat in their huts and warmed themselves by their stoves, or they went to the tavern. Reb Falik and Naphtali spent lots of time together. Reb Falik himself was a treasure trove of stories. He had met many famous squires in his time. He had visited the fairs in Danzig, Leipzig, and Amsterdam. He had even made a trip to the Holy Land and had seen the Western Wall, the cave of Machpelah, and Rachel's tomb. Reb Falik told many tales, and Naphtali wrote them down. Sus's stable was too big for one horse. Reb Falik had a number of old horses on his estate that could no longer work, so Sus wasn't alone. At times, when Naphtali came into the stable to visit his beloved Sus, he saw him bowing his head against the horse on his left or on his right, and it seemed to Naphtali that Sus was listening to stories told him by the other horses, or silently telling his own horsey stories. It's true that horses cannot speak, but God's creatures can make themselves understood without words. That winter, Naphtali wrote many stories. His own, those he had heard from Reb Falik. He set them in type and printed them on his hand press. At times, when the sun shone over the silvery snow, Naphtali hitched Sus and another horse to a sleigh and made a trip through the nearby towns to sell his storybooks or give them away to those who couldn't afford to buy them. Sometimes Reb Falik went along with him. They slept at inns and spent time with merchants, landowners, and Chassidim on their way to visit their rabbi's courts. Each one had a story to tell, and Naphtali either wrote them down or fixed them in his memory. The winter passed, and Naphtali couldn't remember how. On Pesach, Reb Falik's sons and daughters and grandchildren came to celebrate the holiday at the estate, and again Naphtali heard wondrous tales of Warsaw, Krakow, and even Berlin, Paris, and London. The kings waged wars, but scientists made all kinds of discoveries and inventions. Astronomers discovered stars, planets, comets. Archaeologists dug out ruins of ancient cities. Chemists found new elements. In all the countries, tracks were being laid for railroad trains. Museums, libraries, and theaters were being built. Historians uncovered writings from generations past. The writers in every land described the life of the people among whom they dwelled. Mankind could not and would not forget its past. The history of the world grew even richer in detail. Do we go on? I think we finished the story. Okay, good. I don't want to stop this story in the middle. Okay. That spring, something happened that Naphtali had been expecting and therefore dreading. Sus became sick and stopped grazing. The sun shone outside, and Naphtali led Sus out to pasture, where the fresh green grass and many flowers sprouted. Sus sat down in the sunshine, looked at the grass and the flowers, but no longer grazed. A stillness shone out from his eyes, the tranquility of a creature that has lived out its years and is ready to end its story on earth. One afternoon, when Naphtali went out to check on his beloved Sus, he saw that Sus was dead. Naphtali couldn't hold back his tears. Sus had been a part of his life. Naphtali dug a grave for Sus not far from the old oak where Sus had died, and he buried him there. As a marker over the grave, he thrust into the ground the whip that he had never used. Its handle was made of oak. Oddly enough, several weeks later, Naphtali noticed that the whip had turned into a sapling. The handle had put down roots into the earth where Sus lay, and it began to sprout leaves. A tree grew over Sus, a new oak, which drew sustenance from Sus's body. In time, young branches grew out of the tree, and birds sang upon them and built their nests there. Naphtali could hardly bring himself to believe that this dried-out old stick had possessed enough life within it to grow and blossom. Naphtali considered it a miracle. When the tree grew thicker, Naphtali carved Sus's name into the bark, along with the dates of his birth and death. Yes, individual creatures die, but this doesn't end the story of the world. The whole earth, all the stars, all the planets, all of the comets represent within them one divine history, one source of life, one endless and wondrous story that only God knows in its entirety. A few years afterwards, Reb Falik died, and years later, Naphtali the storyteller died. By then, he was famous for his storybooks, not only throughout Poland, but in other countries as well. Before his death, Naphtali asked that he be buried beneath the young oak that had grown over Sus's grave, whose branches touched the old oak. On Naphtali's tombstone were carved these words from Scriptures: lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they are not divided. What a lovely story, isn't that? I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And we are only a minute after our time. Okay, so don't forget, tomorrow night is the Rabbis Discuss. What are you discussing tomorrow? Oh, we're going to continue on with the copycats decision. Okay, well, whatever. Okay, so tomorrow night is Rabbi A and Rabbi Ansel will be back and Rabbi Ansel has a big announcement, so don't miss it. Anyway, that's tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern. And on Wednesday night is the Torah study in depth with Rabbi A. And then Friday is Kabbalat Mariv Shabbat. And on Shabbat is Shachrit Musaf at 10 a.m. Eastern. And then next Monday, God willing, we will be right back here and we will tell some more of these wonderful stories. I hope you will be here. Until then, we shall simply say, Laila Tov.